Have you ever felt it? That quiet whisper at the edge of your life, the subtle trembling in the air, a sense that something is shifting even before your mind can name it. Change is not waiting for permission. It doesn't knock politely at the door of your comfort zone. It arrives unannounced, like the seasons turning, like night falling into dawn. It doesn't ask if you are ready. It simply comes. And yet, here lies the hidden truth. It is not the change itself that determines your destiny, but the way you choose to meet it. Some resist, clinging desperately to what is familiar. Others surrender, allowing the currents of life to carry them into unknown waters. The difference between these two paths is the difference between suffering and awakening. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing at a threshold, behind you the weight of the past, before you a door opening into possibility. To step forward, you must loosen your grip on what you've carried for so long. You must dare to face the shadows within and trust that on the other side of fear there is freedom. Life is not waiting. Every breath you take is an invitation to transform. But most of us hesitate. We convince ourselves that tomorrow will be safer, that we'll be braver later, that circumstances must first align. Yet tomorrow is not promised. The only moment we ever truly hold in our hands is the one unfolding right now. So the question is not, will change come? The question is, when it comes, as it already is, will you meet it awake or asleep? Will you allow it to break you down, or will you allow it to build you up? This journey we are about to walk together is not about becoming someone else. It is about remembering who you are beneath the noise, beyond the masks, deeper than the roles you've been taught to play. It is about peeling back the layers until you stand face to face with the essence of your being, unshakable, luminous, free. The gateway is here. The door is already open. All that remains is the courage to step through. The silence you hear is not empty. It is filled with echoes of everything you've carried with you. We like to believe the world outside is what shapes us, the job, the relationships, the twists of fate. But beneath the surface, something else holds far greater power. It is the unseen cargo we drag behind us, the unspoken grief, the unresolved wounds, the memories we swore we had forgotten. Think of it this way: every experience you never healed becomes a stone placed inside your backpack. At first, you barely notice. One small stone is light, another is manageable. But as the years pass, the weight grows heavier until walking forward feels like dragging a mountain on your back. And yet we keep pretending we are fine. We smile, we perform, we distract ourselves with busyness. But deep inside, those stones are pressing, reshaping, suffocating our spirit. Perhaps you've noticed it in your own life. Why do the same arguments repeat? Why do certain words or people trigger a storm inside you far greater than the situation deserves? These are not random explosions. They are signals. Signals that somewhere within an old wound is still bleeding. We carry anger from betrayals that happened years ago. We carry guilt from choices we regret but never forgave ourselves for. We carry fear, rooted in childhood moments when we felt unsafe or unseen. And the more we avoid looking at them, the louder they demand our attention. Imagine a house. In the corner of the attic, there is a box you never open. You tell yourself it's just old clutter, but inside that box are things you once didn't know how to face. The longer you keep it shut, the more dust it gathers, the heavier it becomes. One day, the weight of that hidden box starts to bend the beams of the entire house. Your soul works in the same way. The burdens you ignore don't disappear. They wait, they grow, until they leak into your words, your habits, your relationships, your health. But here is the difficult, beautiful truth. To lighten the load, you must dare to open the box. You must look at the stone you've been carrying, name it, and bring it into the light. Yes, it is uncomfortable. Yes, it is painful. But every time you face one of these inner stones, it shrinks. What once felt like a boulder becomes a pebble. What once crushed you becomes something you can hold in your hand and finally set down. So as you continue this journey, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what am I still carrying? Which memories keep whispering when the room is quiet? Which emotions rise sharp and hot whenever life presses a certain button? Don't answer quickly. Let the silence speak, because in those answers lies the first step of transformation, the courage to face what you've avoided. Only when you acknowledge the weight you bear can you begin to release it. And once you do, the path ahead, the path toward freedom, becomes lighter, clearer, and full of possibilities. There's a strange rhythm that quietly governs much of our lives. It's not the rhythm of day and night or the ticking of a clock. It's something deeper, something that runs in the background of our minds without us ever noticing. This is the unconscious loop. Every morning you might wake up with the best of intentions. Today will be different. You promise yourself you won't snap at your loved ones, won't lose patience in traffic, won't drown in endless scrolling on your phone. But then, before you even realize it, you're caught in the same patterns again. It's as if invisible hands are guiding you into the same reactions, the same behaviors, the same emotions that you thought you'd outgrown. The truth is, we live most of our lives on autopilot. Neuroscientists estimate that nearly 95% of our daily actions are unconscious habits. That means only 5% is true awareness, true choice. Imagine walking through life, not steering the ship, but drifting wherever the current takes you. That's what happens when the unconscious loop takes control. But here's the part that's even more fascinating and unsettling. These loops don't just appear out of nowhere. They're shaped by hidden triggers buried deep in your memory and emotions. A harsh word from a teacher decades ago may still influence how you react to criticism today. A childhood moment of rejection may echo every time you feel excluded in a group. These triggers live in the shadows, quietly pulling the strings, making sure you respond in ways that feel familiar, even when they don't serve you anymore. Think about it. Have you ever reacted to something and later wondered, why did I get so upset? That wasn't even a big deal. That's a trigger. A small spark setting off an old fire. It's not the present moment you're reacting to. It's the memory of a wound you once carried, playing itself out again. The cycle continues because the mind craves what is familiar, even if it's painful. A part of us prefers the certainty of old suffering over the risk of something new. It feels safer to stay in the loop than to break free. But the cost is high. These unconscious patterns drain our energy, cloud our judgment, and keep us from living fully awake. Imagine a lion pacing in a cage, walking the same path over and over until a groove is worn into the ground. That's what happens in our minds. The more we repeat the same reactions, the deeper the groove becomes, until it feels impossible to step outside it. But the bars of this cage aren't made of steel, they are made of perception. Once we see the loop, we have the chance to change it. The first step is awareness. Simply noticing when you're caught in the pattern weakens its grip. The second step is curiosity. Instead of judging yourself, I always mess up, I can't change, you pause and ask, what triggered this? Where is this really coming from? By turning the spotlight inward, you reveal the hidden strings that have been controlling you. And with awareness and curiosity, you cut them, thread by thread. What's remarkable is that the loop loses its power the moment you become conscious of it. Triggers thrive in the dark, but once exposed to light, they no longer define you. This is where real transformation begins, not by fighting the loop head-on, but by seeing it clearly for what it is. And so the question arises, if so much of our life is shaped by these hidden forces, how do we begin to step outside the cage? How do we not only see the loop, but also loosen the grip of those old triggers? That journey unfolds as we learn the art of breaking the chains, by finding space between the trigger and the response. And that's where we begin to discover freedom. There's a paradox in life that most of us resist at first glance. We think freedom means doing whatever we want, whenever we want. No rules, no boundaries, no structure. But if you've ever lived that way, even for a short time, you know it doesn't lead to freedom at all. It leads to chaos, regret, and a sense of being lost. True freedom doesn't come from escaping responsibility. It comes from embracing it. Responsibility is not a burden. It's the doorway to power. When you take responsibility, you stop pointing fingers at circumstances, at people, at fate. You stop saying, I can't help it, that's just the way I am. Instead, you realize, my life is my own. My choices are mine, and the direction I move in begins with me. That's the first spark of freedom, the moment you reclaim authorship over your story. But responsibility alone is not enough, because even when you know what needs to be done, the temptation to slip back into old patterns is strong. This is where discipline enters. Discipline is not punishment, it's the practice of aligning your daily actions with the life you want to live. It's the steady bridge between intention and reality. Think of an artist. Inspiration alone won't create a masterpiece. It's the daily discipline of showing up at the canvas, even when the brush feels heavy, that brings vision into form. In the same way, your life is your canvas. Every day you choose whether to add another careless stroke or to paint with deliberate care. And here's the truth most people miss. Discipline is freedom. At first, it feels restrictive. Waking up early, training your body, watching your thoughts, choosing your words carefully. These may seem like chains, but look closer. Every act of discipline carves out space where you are no longer controlled by impulse or habit. Each choice gives you strength to stand above the unconscious loop we spoke of before. Discipline doesn't cage you, it sets you free from the cage you didn't even know you were in. Imagine a warrior sharpening his sword every morning. That sword is not for show. It's what allows him to walk into the unknown with confidence. Discipline is your sharpening stone. It prepares you for life's battles, both seen and unseen. Without it, you walk unarmed, at the mercy of every trigger and temptation. With it, you walk with clarity, grounded in your own power. And when responsibility and discipline come together, something remarkable happens. Freedom is no longer an illusion. It's no longer a distant dream. It becomes the lived reality of each day. You are no longer a slave to emotions, no longer trapped by the unconscious loop. You may not control what life throws at you, but you control how you meet it. And in that space lies unshakable freedom. But freedom, like a flame, must be guarded. The world around us constantly tugs at our attention, tempting us to abandon the very practices that set us free. That's why discipline isn't a one-time act. It's a lifelong companion. And responsibility isn't a weight to carry. It's a gift that strengthens you with every choice you make. So, the question arises, once we've accepted responsibility and practiced discipline, how do we transform these inner strengths into true resilience, into the ability to stand unshaken even when life strikes us at our core? That's the doorway we now step through. The path of resilience and the discovery of your unbreakable center. The past has a way of clinging to us, like shadows that stretch far beyond the moment the light has shifted. It's easy to think of the past as something that's behind us, something finished, closed, gone. But in truth, the past is alive in us right now, in the way we see ourselves, in the choices we make, in the fears we carry and the masks we wear. Our identity is built from stories we've told ourselves over and over again. Stories about who we are, where we came from, what we're capable of, what we deserve. Some of those stories are empowering. They remind us of our strength, our resilience, our courage. But many of them are chains, invisible yet heavy. A child who once felt abandoned grows into an adult afraid of being left. A teenager who was mocked for failing becomes an adult who avoids risk at any cost. These old stories become the lens through which we see the world, convincing us that the past is not only real but permanent. But here's the truth. Identity is not a prison cell, it's a costume. And like any costume, it can be taken off. The roles you play, the names you've been given, the expectations others have placed on you, none of these are the essence of who you are. They are simply layers, added and reinforced over time. The danger is not in wearing them, it's in forgetting that you can choose to take them off. The power of letting go begins with this realization. You are not your past. You are not your wounds. You are not the labels others stamped onto you. You are awareness itself, the open space in which all of these experiences have appeared and faded. Just as clouds drift across the sky without staining it, your past drifts through memory without ever touching your true essence. Letting go is not about denying the past. It's not about pretending those wounds didn't happen. It's about no longer carrying them as part of your identity. Imagine holding a burning coal in your hand. The longer you cling to it, the deeper it burns. The pain does not come from the fire itself. It comes from your refusal to release it. The moment you let go, healing begins. Of course, letting go is not easy. The mind resists it because even suffering feels familiar. And the familiar, no matter how painful, feels safer than the unknown. But every time you loosen your grip on the past, you make space for something new to enter. Every act of release is a declaration. I am more than my history. I am alive, right here, right now. When you let go, identity becomes fluid instead of fixed. You are no longer defined by old roles or limited by old wounds. You become free to grow, to expand, to step into possibilities that once felt unreachable. And in that freedom, you discover a deeper truth. Life is not about clinging, it's about flowing. This is where real transformation begins. Because the moment you stop being chained to the past, you step into the present with clarity and strength. And in the present lies the only place where change is possible, where healing is real, where freedom can be lived. So the question emerges, if letting go of the past gives us this freedom, how do we learn to live fully in the present without being pulled back into old loops or pushed forward by anxious projections of the future? The answer lies in cultivating presence, an awakened stillness that reveals the truth of who you are beneath all stories. There is a quiet miracle that happens in every single moment, though most of us never notice it. It is the bridge between life and death, between chaos and calm, between the endless chatter of the mind and the silence of the present. That miracle is the breath. The breath is the first thing we do when we enter this world and the last thing we do before we leave it. Everything in between is carried on its rhythm. And yet, how rarely we pay attention to it. We live as if the breath is simply background noise, when in reality it is the thread that weaves together body and mind. Think of your body as the earth, solid, grounded, physical. Think of your mind as the sky, expansive, restless, filled with constant movement. Without the breath, they drift apart. The body goes on in its routines, the mind races into past and future, and we feel split, disconnected, torn between worlds. But when the breath becomes conscious, something extraordinary happens. The body and the mind reunite. Every inhale is an invitation. Every exhale is a release. When you breathe with awareness, you are not just keeping yourself alive. You are returning home to yourself. You begin to notice that the body is not merely flesh and bone, but a vessel of energy. The mind is not merely a storm of thoughts, but a space of awareness. And the breath is the river that allows these two worlds to merge as one. Try it now. Inhale slowly, feeling the cool air enter your lungs. Hold it for a brief moment, noticing the stillness. Then exhale gently, as if you are letting go of a burden you've carried too long. Do this a few times and you'll feel something shift. Your racing thoughts begin to quiet. Your tense shoulders soften. Your awareness returns to the present moment. This is not imagination. It is the direct experience of mind, body, and breath aligning into one rhythm. This unity is the essence of meditation. Many believe meditation is about emptying the mind, but in truth, it is about coming into harmony. When you follow the breath, the body becomes steady, the mind becomes clear, and what was once fragmented becomes whole again. You stop being at war with yourself. Instead, you become a single, flowing presence. And here lies the hidden power. When body, mind, and breath are united, you step out of the unconscious loop. You are no longer a prisoner of triggers or old patterns. Instead, you become the witness, the observer, the calm center from which all clarity arises. Life no longer pulls you in every direction because you have discovered the anchor within. The masters say that one conscious breath is enough to return you to your true self. Just one. Because in that breath there is no past to regret, no future to fear. There is only life, raw and real, unfolding in this very instant. And when you live from this place, freedom is not something to chase, it is something you are. So the question becomes, once we taste this harmony, how do we carry it beyond the cushion, beyond moments of meditation, into the noise and rush of everyday life? How do we protect this inner stillness when the outer world threatens to scatter it again? That path opens as we learn the art of resilience, the discovery of our unshakable center. We often imagine change as something outside of us. A new job, a new city, a new relationship, a new chapter of life. We think if only the circumstances shift, then I will finally feel at peace, finally be free. But no matter how many times we rearrange the outer world, the same storms return within us. Because lasting change doesn't begin on the outside, it begins on the inside. Inner change is the foundation. It's the rewiring of thought patterns, the softening of old wounds, the awakening of awareness. Without it, outer change is fragile. You can escape one environment, but you carry the same fears and habits with you. You can enter a new relationship, but the same insecurities follow. You can chase new goals, but the same restless hunger remains. Nothing truly shifts until the inner self transforms. But here's the paradox: outer change still matters. It reflects and reinforces what's happening within. When you begin to change inside, when you cultivate discipline, awareness, compassion, your outer life naturally begins to rearrange itself. Toxic relationships fall away. Destructive habits lose their grip. New opportunities emerge, almost as if the world itself is responding to your growth. The outer mirrors the inner. It's like planting a seed. At first, the change is invisible, happening quietly beneath the soil. That's the inner work: patience, care, nourishment. But eventually, shoots break through the ground, leaves spread toward the light, and the change becomes visible to everyone. That's the outer transformation. But it could never have happened without the hidden work beneath the surface. This is why real change cannot be forced from the outside. You can push yourself to wear a mask, to fake confidence, to mimic happiness. But if the roots inside are still tangled in fear and anger, the mask eventually cracks. True outer change is not performance, it is reflection. It shines because something within you has already shifted. And so, the journey of transformation is not choosing between inner and outer change. It is learning to weave the two together. Inner change provides depth and stability. Outer change provides expression and proof. One without the other is incomplete. Think of it this way: if inner change is the flame, outer change is the light it casts. A flame hidden in a cave may burn, but it illuminates nothing. A lamp with no flame looks impressive, but it gives no warmth. Together, they reveal the true power of transformation, radiance that spreads from within to without and from without back to within. So when you ask yourself, what needs to change in my life? Don't only look outward. Ask also, what is changing in me? What old patterns can I release? What new strengths am I ready to embrace? Because once the shift takes root inside, the outer world has no choice but to align with it. And here lies the most profound discovery. When you change within, you don't just transform your own life, you become a catalyst. Your presence influences others, your energy reshapes environments, your example inspires those around you. Inner change ripples outward, touching the world in ways you may never fully see. But transformation does not end there. Because change, by its very nature, brings discomfort. To grow is to step into the unknown, to leave behind the familiar, to walk into uncertainty. And the next step on this journey is learning to embrace discomfort, not as an enemy, but as a guide. Every destiny begins with a single thought. It may seem like an exaggeration at first, but pause for a moment and look back at your own life. Wasn't it a single idea, a single decision, a single yes or no that shaped the direction of your path? The thought became a choice, the choice became a habit, the habit became a character, and the character carved the road you now walk. This is the unseen thread, the invisible connection between what happens in the silent chambers of your mind and what unfolds in the outer world. Most people dismiss thoughts as fleeting, weightless, harmless. But thoughts are seeds, and every seed has the potential to grow into a forest. The question is, what kind of forest are you planting? Negative thoughts, resentment, fear, doubt, take root silently. They grow into patterns of avoidance, self-sabotage, bitterness. Over time, they shape a destiny of limitation, A life where possibilities are unseen because the mind has already decided they are impossible. Positive thoughts, courage, kindness, gratitude also take root. They blossom into patience, resilience, openness. And in time, they shape a destiny of abundance and clarity. Your outer world is nothing more than the echo of your inner dialogue. The way you speak to yourself becomes the way life speaks back to you. Think small, live small. Think expansive, live expansive. The universe doesn't punish or reward, it reflects. But here's the challenge. Most of our thoughts are not conscious. They are the loops we explored earlier, the conditioned beliefs, the hidden triggers, the echoes of the past. Which means if you do not guide your thoughts, they will guide you. And the path they lead you down may not be one you ever intended to walk. This is why awareness is power. The moment you observe a thought, you interrupt the thread before it hardens into destiny. You see it for what it is, just an impulse, just energy passing through. It does not define you. You can choose to let it go, or you can choose to nurture it into something greater. That choice is the beginning of freedom. Imagine standing before two rivers. One flows toward bitterness, the other toward wisdom. Every thought you entertain is like a drop of water. Over time, the river you feed becomes stronger, wider, unstoppable. That river will eventually carry you where it flows, whether you want it to or not. So the question is simple but profound. Which river are you feeding? When you understand this, you stop underestimating the small moments. One kind thought can shift an entire day. One generous intention can ripple through countless lives. And one repeated thought, nurtured with care, can slowly transform who you are and where you are heading. Destiny is not written in the stars. It is written in the mind. And if thoughts are the thread, awareness is the hand that weaves. Each moment is a chance to notice, to choose, to redirect. This is how you reclaim authorship over your own fate. But there is a deeper layer still. For even as we guide our thoughts, we eventually realize that the mind is never fully still. It creates stories, judgments, fears, hopes. If we cling too tightly to these, we remain entangled in the thread. The final step is not only to guide thoughts, but to step beyond them into the vast silence that holds them all. And that silence, that vastness, is where true transformation finds its deepest roots. Awakening is not a private treasure you lock away in the depths of your heart. It is a flame, and like every flame, its nature is to spread. When you begin to live awake, your very presence becomes a kind of teaching. You no longer need to convince, persuade, or preach. People simply feel it. They sense the steadiness in your voice, the calm in your eyes, the clarity in your choices. And in that quiet way, you are already passing it on. To live awake is to walk through life with open eyes. You see the triggers rising, but you are not enslaved by them. You notice fear, but you are not consumed by it. You encounter suffering, but instead of turning away, you meet it with compassion. This is not perfection, it is presence. A willingness to meet life exactly as it is, without the layers of illusion or denial that once clouded your vision. The beauty of this path is that it multiplies. When you embody awareness, others are reminded of their own. When you choose kindness over bitterness, you create ripples that travel farther than you will ever see. A gentle word may soften someone's burden. A patient silence may prevent a conflict. A single act of understanding may change the course of another person's day or even their life. And yet, to pass on awakening is not to impose. It is to offer. Like water flowing down a mountain, it finds its own way to nourish the thirsty. Sometimes it's through a conversation. Sometimes through silence. Sometimes through the way you live your ordinary moments, with patience in traffic, with gratitude at the table, with forgiveness when hurt arises. In this way, life itself becomes the teaching. Think of a tree. It does not try to persuade others to rest in its shade. It simply stands, rooted and alive, and because of that, weary travelers are drawn to its presence. The tree does not force its fruit on anyone, yet those who hunger are nourished. To live awake is to become like that tree, steady, giving, and naturally magnetic. But awakening is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of responsibility. Because once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you know, you cannot pretend not to know. The gift of awareness comes with the duty to live it, to embody it, to pass it forward, not for recognition, but for the quiet transformation of the world around you. And here lies the great paradox. By passing it on, you deepen your own awakening. Each time you choose patience over anger, you reinforce your own freedom. Each time you choose compassion over judgment, you strengthen your own heart. In guiding others, you are guiding yourself. In lifting others, you rise too. So the question remains, how do we carry this flame beyond today, beyond this very moment? How do we ensure that the light of change we've kindled does not fade but continues to grow, touching lives long after we are gone? The answer lies in the final step of this journey, the closing of one door and the opening of another, the moment when change is no longer just an idea, but a way of being. Every journey begins with a single step, and by listening, reflecting, and opening yourself to these truths, you've already taken yours. Change is not a distant summit waiting at the end of your life. It is a path that unfolds with each breath, each choice, each moment you decide to live awake. Perhaps along the way you have felt the weight of your old patterns, the unconscious loops that held you captive. Perhaps you've recognized the stories of the past that shaped your identity, or the triggers that controlled your reactions. And yet, in the very act of seeing them, you've begun to loosen their grip. Awareness is the first liberation. You've discovered that responsibility is not a burden but a doorway to freedom. That discipline is not a chain but the sharpening of your spirit. That body, mind, and breath are not separate realms but one unified presence. You've seen how thoughts weave the thread of destiny, and how letting go reveals the vast stillness beyond them. You've felt the possibility of living not half asleep but awake, and in that awakening becoming a light for others. But here is the most important truth. This is not the end. It never was. This is only the opening of the door. Transformation is not a story to listen to, it is a life to be lived. And the invitation now is simple: step through. Step into responsibility. Step into discipline. Step into presence. Step into compassion. Step into the unknown, not as something to fear, but as the only place where growth is possible. The path will not always be comfortable. There will be moments of doubt, resistance, even pain. But beneath it all, there will also be clarity, strength, and the deep joy of living true. Remember this: change is not a thunderclap that strikes once and is done. It is a rhythm, a practice, a returning. Every day you will be invited again to choose awareness over habit, love over fear, freedom over the old familiar chains. And every time you choose, you plant a seed. Those seeds will become forests, not only for you, but for everyone who walks in your shade. So this is the invitation. Do not just listen, but live. Do not just understand, but embody. Do not just walk the path, but leave it brighter for those who follow. The door of change is open before you. The only question left is, will you step through? If these reflections touched your heart, allow them to accompany you beyond this moment. Let the teachings of Zen Buddhism continue to guide your days. If this resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we walk together, exploring the path of awareness, compassion, and peace. May every video be a gentle reminder that within you already lies the wisdom you seek.